In episode 31, Gabe presents his list of the top 10 most violent tornadoes in U.S. history. This is Behind the Storms. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Behind the Storms. Today I'm going to cover what I believe are the top 10 violent tornadoes in U.S. history. Now, this problem inherently is very subjective. For every tornado nerd, you could probably get a unique list of top 10 violent tornadoes. And the question is, what criteria do you use? I mean, you can use wind speed or damage, and how do you account for the interaction of the tornado with the built environment? And technically, a violent tornado is a tornado that produces F4 or F5 damage. But the problem itself is a bit narrow to use that definition because, well, at least the violent tornado definition, because many powerful tornadoes strike nothing at all. And so their violence is never manifested. Other tornadoes, like the Joplin tornado of 2011, were probably amplified, at least in some measure, by the presence of large amounts of debris, which made them more damaging than they might have otherwise been. And some tornadoes create more violent damage simply by staying in the same place for long periods of time, like the Gerald, Texas tornado. Still, other tornadoes, like the El Reno tornado of 2013, for example, are well capable of great violence, but they remain out in open fields. So really, any criteria for quote-unquote most violent would be entirely subjective and not in the least comprehensive. However, there are several tornadoes that stick out to tornado aficionados as particularly violent. I would say the usual criteria for determining this is usually a subjective combination of 5 different things. The first criterion is maximum damage rating. In particular, the question is, how complete was the damage caused by the tornado? Were the structures well built, or were they kind of extraordinary distances? And was the ground scoured? Or maybe pavement, was that scoured? Those are some things that you look at in determining the maximum damage rating. The second criterion I would imagine for this rating would be to look at the overall area of the maximum damage rating. So, for example, how wide is the F5 swath? The question would be, how many houses took EF4 or 5 damage? The wider the EF4/5 swath is, the more the total energy. That said, there have been examples of some smaller kind of wicked tornadoes. A few of those that come to mind are the Pampa, Texas tornado on June 8, 1995, or the Arnett, Oklahoma tornado on May 4th, 2007. These are kind of what they call the drill bit tornadoes that spin really, really fast, and even though they're very tiny, are capable of really extreme damage. I guess the third criterion is difficult to find because, it's difficult to get measurements within tornadoes. There are only a few ways to get these wind speed measurements. For example, you can get them through mobile Doppler radar, but most violent tornadoes are not actually sampled by high-resolution radar. Another way is anemometer data. Some research groups have deployed anemometers in front of tornadoes. And some weather stations with anemometers have been hit, but these strikes are very rare. And still another method is photogrammetry. This is a method used to extract tornadic wind speeds from tornado video, tornado debris, and condensation to make a wind speed estimate. These wind speed estimates can only be made of the visible parts of the funnel. Often, the more violent parts of the tornado are obscured by condensation. The fourth criterion, I would say, is tornado longevity. In and of itself, tornado longevity is not a measure of tornado violence, but a longer-lasting tornado generally has better odds of creating violent damage. And all else being equal in terms of damage and fatalities, a longer-lasting tornado will generally be regarded as a more impressive tornado. And the final criterion I would identify is the number of fatalities that the tornado produced. Obviously, a tornado must hit populated areas to produce fatalities. This fact also increases the likelihood of violent EF4 or 5 damage. Though other tornadoes may be stronger in open fields, the tornado with the greatest number of fatalities will probably be thought of as more violent. So, the relative weighting of these criteria is very debatable. But the following list comprises many of the tornadoes that would appear on most violent tornado lists. These tornadoes were all F5s, violent tornado lists. These tornadoes were all F5s, the most powerful and rare of tornadoes. So without further ado, number 10, Greensburg, Kansas. This tornado struck Greensburg, Kansas on May 4th, 2007. This storms in northwest Oklahoma. We did not chase after dark, and that was definitely much to my chagrin because what happened was very historical. A storm formed in southwest Kansas very close to dark and very quickly became tornadic, producing a set of tornadoes near Protection, Kansas. After those tornadoes, a very large tornado formed northeast of Protection that ultimately became the tornado that hit Greensburg, Kansas. The tornado struck after 10 p.m., destroying 95% of the town. Overall, the path length was 22 miles, and it had a maximum width of 1.7 miles wide. Now, I went to the town after the tornado, the next day, in fact, and I just could not believe how extensive the devastation was. The entire town had been enveloped. It wasn't exactly a tiny town. It was the county seat, and it was just unreal. Now, that tornado, as powerful as it was, may not have actually been the strongest tornado in the event. The next tornado was even longer lived, and it was huge, up to 2 miles wide, and based on it had been stronger, but there is no way of knowing because it hit almost entirely rural areas. Number 9, Ohio. This was part of the infamous super outbreak in 1974. This tornado killed 32 people, and in fact was the most infamous tornado of the outbreak. It was initially multiple vortex, but it grew to be a half-mile wide wedge, and it hit the Windsor Park in Arrowhead subdivisions in Xenia. Rows of houses were leveled, with little debris remaining. Trees were taken off very near the base and were debarked, and the path. Number 8, Bridge Creek, Oklahoma, May 3rd, 1999. Famous tornado, and especially in Chaser community, for being a very large and powerful tornado. In fact, it was part of the largest outbreak of tornadoes in Oklahoma history, and it was the most famous one, and it was up to a mile wide on the ground for 36 miles, with up to 300 mile per hour wide, the Doppler on wheels, just as it was hitting Bridge Creek. The tornado went on to hit more, causing devastation and damage there. The tornado at Bridge Creek remains synonymous with violent tornadoes, especially in the Chaser community. Number 7, Udall, Kansas, May 25th, 1905. This tornado formed after dark. In fact, it was part of another large outbreak of tornadoes, and the bulk of the outbreak actually happened quite a bit earlier in the day with a long-track F4 tornado from the Texas Panhandle into western Oklahoma. This tornado formed in the same tornadic complex that struck Blackwell that night, with a half-mile wide tornado that killed 20 people. That tornado dissipated, but a new tornado formed in southern Kansas. This new tornado quickly became large and violent, up to a half-mile wide. It hit Udall dead on at 10th tornado in Kansas history. After 50 miles on the ground, the tornado dissipated. Number 6, the Hackleburg, Phil Campbell, Alabama tornado, April 27th, 2011. This tornado was up to 1.25 mile wide. It killed 72 people along its 132 mile path. It scoured concrete over a 25-yard swath, and it leveled houses in many places. And of course, trees were snapped off at the base with only debarked stumps remaining. It is definitely one of the most extreme. Number 5, Andover, Kansas, April 26, 19. This was again a part of a larger outbreak of tornadoes. This tornado formed near Clearwater, Kansas, southwest of Wichita by roughly 20 miles. It was narrow when it formed and had some multiple vortex tendencies, but generally speaking, it was just a cone. And right around the time it crossed I-35, it actually hit a plant. The tornado became pink in color due to flowers being lofted and rotated around the tornado. Now, as it came closer to the McConnell Air Force Base on the south side of Wichita, it became multiple vortex. It narrowly missed a line of multi-billion-dollar B-1 bombers. After the Air Force Base, the tornado dramatically widened and intensified. It reached a peak width of 3/4 of a mile wide when it hit Andover. Video taken from around the tornado showed an unbelievably powerful vortex. Just as someone who has watched a lot of tornado video, I can tell you this is probably the most violent wedge tornado I've ever seen on video. So some of those subvortices that you could see, which are basically smaller tornadoes within the larger tornado, erupted skyward in violent fashion as it tore through the Golden Spur Mobile Home Park, where it killed 13 people. A car was thrown 3/4 of a mile, and it couldn't be recognized as a car or a truck. The tornado lasted over an hour and was on the ground for 46 miles. And this was the same day as the overpass video, which has become kind of infamous in the years since, because it actually has caused a lot of people to think that taking shelter under an overpass is actually a good idea. It turns out, though, May 3rd, 1999, with tornado, as it was moving towards Moore, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma City, it actually killed some people under overpasses. So it showed once and for all that really overpasses are actually terrible shelters for a variety of reasons. Number 4, Jordan, Iowa. This happened on June 6. Dr. Ted Fujita, who invented the F scale, said it was the most intense tornado he'd ever surveyed in his career. So we definitely have to add this to the list. It was on a day when there was extreme instability and a stalled boundary in Iowa. This is a common pattern for Iowa's end and busts, as many storm chasers know, but this day it did not. The tornado was accompanied by a strong anticyclonic F3 tornado, which lasted in concert with the F5 tornado for 25 minutes. The circulation was similar to the May 24th, 2016 tornadic storm when it was southwest of Dodge City, where there was a very close cyclonic-anticyclonic pair. Anyway, both tornadoes took unusual paths, the result of the tornadoes rotating around their circulation. These are known as cycloidal paths. The tornado was up to 1 mile in diameter, and fortunately, it didn't kill anyone. Gerald, Texas, May 27th, 1997. This tornado formed north of Austin, Texas, just west of Interstate 35. It was a day with extreme instability. I think it was up to like 8,000 Cape and was associated with a slow-moving cold front. The slow-moving parent thunderstorm moved south along the cold front. Now, that's a very unusual path. It was able to in the environment and produce a lot of tornadoes. It destroyed the small hamlet of Gerald. This town only had 410 people, and it hit the Double Creek subdivision, where it killed 27 people. In general, most violent tornadoes only kill 1% of the people in the path. This tornado killed nearly 7% of the people it hit. That's nearly an order of magnitude higher death rate than the ordinary F5 tornado. And the damage was incredible. The entire Double Creek addition was leveled. Not a single house was standing. Not only did the tornado level the houses, but even the grass was uprooted. There wasn't anything left. In some places, concrete pavement was scoured. Part of that was likely attributable to the slow motion of the tornado. However, out of all the modern examples of damage, the Gerald, Texas tornado damage is probably the most extreme. Number 2, Woodward, Oklahoma, April 9th, 1947. This storm hit Glacier and Higgins, Texas, as well as Woodward, Oklahoma directly, over its 125-mile path. The Woodward tornado was part of a larger tornado family. The first tornado formed near White Deer, Texas. And that tornado was pretty powerful and actually did some significant damage. The next tornado Tampa and didn't do a whole lot. When that tornado dissipated, the worst tornado developed near Canadian Texas and the eastern Texas panhandle. It leveled the town of Glacier, killing 17 people. This town is now unincorporated, likely in part because of this tornado. Higgins, Texas, killing 51. Next, this tornado moved into rural Oklahoma, where it leveled several houses and killed several people. The worst devastation, however, was saved up for Woodward, Oklahoma, a city that was built around the rail lines that transported cattle across the plains. At the time of the tornado, Woodward had a population. The tornado struck about 8:30, which was after sunset that time of year. It was an almost unbelievable 2 miles wide. Unfortunately, killed 107 people. Over 100 city blocks were completely devastated. The city's power plant was also hit. A 40,000-pound tank was tossed a block and a half. Unbelievably, the parent thunderstorm continued producing tornadoes through the night, all the way to Topeka, Kansas. In total, the storm produced tornadoes over 465 miles. And finally, number one. This is going to be obvious to everybody. The Tri-State tornado of March 18th, 1925. By every objective measure, this is the most violent tornado in history. It formed just northeast of the so-called triple point system. The triple point is basically the intersection of the warm front, the cold front, and the dry line. And it is called the Tri-State tornado because it hit 3 states, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. It is the worst tornado in American history. Officially, nearly 700 people died. And this likely represents the low of probable fatalities, as a number of the fatalities weren't counted. Officially, it had a 219-mile path. Now, the town of Gorham was the first to be hit, where 37 of the 500 residents that lived there were killed. Right when it hit was about a mile wide. Around there were actually tornadoes. Murfreesboro, Illinois was next. Of the 10,000 people who lived there, 234 were killed. The tornado reached strength near DeSoto, Illinois, where that town was demolished. The entire town of 700 was destroyed. 69 people died, or about 10% of the population. This is absolutely stunning, especially given the usual 1% death rate for violent tornadoes. Houses, trees were taken off at the base, and the stumps were debarked. Grass was even ripped out of the ground. What came after this? Nearly 150 people died there in a town of 9,000. And it really could have been worse in West Frankfort. Many of the citizens were miners. They were actually underground when the tornado hit, likely saving their lives. When they heard the roar of the tornado, they came up to see what was going on. They emerged to see complete devastation. The tornado lasted 3.5 hours. Considering that most tornadoes last less than 5 minutes, this is nothing short of incredible. There has been some question as to whether or not this was one complete path or a series of merging tornadoes from one tornadic storm. However, a study by Bob Johns and collaborators found that the tornado was likely one continuous path. In fact, they were able to find 19 more miles to the 219-mile original path length, bringing the total path length to an astounding 238 miles. Now, there have been other tornadoes that have been very impressive, many of which I've Preston, Mississippi tornado on April 27, 2011, during the 2011 super outbreak. It actually dug a trench in the ground. And there's actually a video of this online on YouTube. You can check it out. Also, the Clarendon tornado of June 8, 1995, not only did it wipe a house off its foundation, it actually peeled away some of the concrete foundation. Can you believe that? It's just incredible. And actually, to my knowledge, it wasn't actually even surveyed by the National Weather Service. Anyway, so these are just some of the tornadoes that have occurred throughout the United States history, ones that really had the biggest impact. Well, that about does it for this episode of Behind the Storms. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Behind the Storms. You can subscribe to and review our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and Stitcher, or listen at behindthestorms.com. If you have any comments, questions, or ideas, feel free to email us at behindthestorms@gmail.com. Additionally, you can follow and share our posts on Facebook, Instagram. Just search for Behind the Storms. Thanks, everyone.